one drone launched in the dead of night cripple an entire military artery deep inside Russia. At 2:47 a.m. on October 12, 2025, a sudden flash cut through the darkness above Novocherkassk, nearly 900 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Beneath that still sky, a small partisan unit of the Atesh network lay motionless Ukrainians and Russian defectors, working side by side, tracking a 2,000-ton train carrying artillery shells bound for the southern front. Their weapon was not brute force, but precision, a Switchblade 600 drone flying at 185 km/h, programmed to hit a concrete signal control post rather than the train itself. Within seconds of impact, the entire railway's electronic brain went dark. The brakes screeched. The train froze mid-route. This single strike marked the collapse of a critical supply line feeding 60% of Russia's artillery on the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson fronts. According to Defense News, Moscow's own logistics officers had recently flagged this corridor as indispensable to southern resupply. Now it had been paralyzed not by a missile strike, but by a laptop and a drone worth less than $10,000. Western analysts described it as a surgical amputation of Russia's wartime bloodstream. How could such a small team outthink a military superpower? The answer lay in preparation. Atesh intelligence operatives, supported by local insiders, spent weeks mapping every inch of the 12-mile segment. They exploited a 3.6-degree blind spot in the Nebo-M radar, a technical flaw known to NATO engineers since 2023, allowing the drone to fly invisibly just meters above ground. They also waged psychological warfare by spreading rumors of an FSB mole inside the Rostov command. They forced Russian officers to slash night patrols by half. Reuters later confirmed that the FSB initiated an internal investigation after the sabotage, diverting valuable manpower from frontline security. When the signal box exploded, it triggered a cascade of chaos. The driver followed protocol. Unsignaled tracks mean an emergency stop. The train's brakes screamed, echoing through the industrial sprawl as sparks rained across the rails. At that precise moment, Atesh operatives detonated a chain of M18A1 Claymore mines hidden beneath gravel. Each mine hurled 700 steel balls at supersonic speed, tearing through rails and sleepers, twisting metal like ribbon. The rails were not merely damaged, they were gone. Satellite images from BBC Verify the next morning showed a 50-meter stretch of track missing its ballast, cratered like the surface of the moon. DW's defense desk called the incident a model example of low-cost warfare producing high-value paralysis. In Moscow, the defense ministry blamed Ukrainian terrorists, while Kyiv's Strategic Communications Center described it more poetically, a small operation with large consequences. The deeper shock came in the realization that Russia's multi-billion-dollar anti-drone network had failed utterly. Pantsir S-1 defenses and LIR-3 jamming systems surrounded the region, yet none detected the low-flying Switchblade. A Pentagon briefing leaked to Al Jazeera days later noted that American contractors had trained Ukrainian teams to exploit micro-terrain masking, using geography as armor. The result was not only a broken rail, but a shattered illusion of invulnerability. And as alarms began flashing across nearby radar stations, the Russians faced a grim reality. Their billion-dollar logistics grid could be brought down by a single 10K drone. The first act of the night was complete, but its echo was just beginning. If this was only the opening strike, how would Russia respond once it realized the real threat had yet to reveal itself? What happens when the hunter mistakes its own shadow for the enemy? Minutes after the first explosion in Novocherkassk, Russia's sophisticated air defense network came alive. Nebo-M radar operators, jolted from fatigue, detected multiple fast-moving contacts streaking through the night. Commanders ordered immediate interception. 3 Bayraktar TB2 drones appeared high, bright, and impossible to ignore. Within seconds, the Pantsir S-1 battery locked on and launched 3 57E6 missiles. To Russian operators, it looked like a clean sweep, 3 threats up, 3 down. But the reality was far more humiliating. Those drones were decoys. The true weapon, a modified Orlan-10, once Russian, now repurposed by Ukrainian engineers, approached silently from an entirely different vector. It wasn't listening for commands. It didn't need to. Using a combination of inertial navigation and optical terrain mapping, it flew autonomously, matching the landscape below to satellite imagery stored in its onboard system. No radio, no GPS, nothing to jam. NATO intelligence officials, quoted by The Guardian, called this technique digital dead reckoning, a low-tech genius solution that defied even Russia's latest electronic warfare grid. At precisely 2:56 a.m., the Orlan began emitting a powerful X-band radar signature identical to a Ukrainian missile drone's targeting radar. The deception was flawless. Convinced a high-value target was approaching, the Pantsir's fire control computer reacquired and fired 6 missiles each, worth over $500,000, toward the phantom source. Only the target wasn't the Orlan. The missiles streaked 2 miles off course directly into a poorly guarded Russian ammunition depot. The resulting blast was apocalyptic. 15,000 pounds of artillery shells erupted in a fireball that rose 300 feet into the air, visible from Rostov to Taganrog. For seconds, night turned to day. Local media captured the orange plume from miles away before authorities imposed a communication blackout. According to Reuters satellite imagery, the blast carved a crater nearly 20 meters deep, with shockwaves shattering windows in neighboring villages. Western defense analysts compared the incident to a reverse friendly fire of the century. Ukraine, by hacking physics rather than networks, had turned Russia's own missile system into its executioner. It's the most cost-efficient strike since the war began, noted Defense News, calculating that Russia lost over $30 million in equipment in under 5 minutes. Behind the spectacle lay something deeper, a test of doctrine. NATO sources told DW that the Orlan modification represented a Western-assisted experiment in autonomous deception, part of a wider push to simulate electronic signatures that lure advanced systems into self-destruction. The technique, first theorized by RAND analysts in 2024, is now being observed in real combat. Back in Novocherkassk, Atesh partisans listened to distant detonations echoing like thunder. They had just made an entire battalion's worth of ammunition vanish without firing a single conventional shot. Yet victory brought new danger. Russian command posts scrambled for retaliation, dispatching aircraft to scour the region for saboteur heat signatures. In that moment, Ukraine's cleverness met Russia's fury. The next move would no longer be an algorithm, it would be blood and metal. Could the partisans survive once the machines gave way to manned revenge? Can a handful of partisans outwit a Russian attack helicopter designed to hunt tanks in the desert? At 2:58 a.m., the roar of turbine blades split the silence. A Mi-28 Havoc gunship rose from a nearby base, its thermal sensors sweeping the scorched horizon where the ammunition depot had vanished. This was no automated response. It was personal, a human hunt for the team that had just humiliated an entire Russian air defense division. From 5 miles out, the Havoc pilot locked on to faint infrared blips, 3 human heat signatures, and scattered electronic residue along the destroyed railway. For Moscow, this was the redemption strike. The helicopter's VK-R anti-tank missiles streaked through the night at Mach 1.8, closing the distance in just 14 seconds. On the ground, the Atesh unit had no time for sophisticated countermeasures. They had one chance, a crude radio frequency jammer, barely more than a car battery wired to an antenna. When the missile's radar seeker entered its terminal phase, the team leader flipped the switch. A burst of chaotic noise flooded the guidance frequency, blinding the missile's brain. 9 seconds in its trajectory faltered, then spiraled off into an empty field, detonating harmlessly in a burst of wasted fire. BBC Newsnight, citing NATO signal analysis teams, later confirmed that this jamming pulse lasted less than 4 seconds, but was perfectly timed enough to confuse the seeker without giving away the team's location. Still, the havoc wasn't done. Circling low, it unleashed its 30mm cannon in a sweeping arc, lighting up the tree line like a welding torch. The forest floor erupted in dirt and shrapnel. The Atesh fighters crawled through the mud, moving between thermal shadows, using the dying flames of the depot as camouflage. According to Defense News, U.S. advisors had briefed Ukrainian special units months earlier on how to exploit infrared clutter from fires and industrial heat sources, a trick now saving lives in real time. But the Russians had a final card to play: the Partisans ground-based laser system. Installed nearby to blind incoming drones, it began sweeping the area, its invisible beam designed to burn out optical sensors. For years, Moscow had touted this technology as proof of its dominance in directed energy warfare. Yet the Atesh team's remaining support drones didn't rely on cameras. They were tether-guided FPV units connected by fiber optic cable to operators a mile away, immune to jamming or laser interference. At this stage, Western observers watching satellite feeds in Ramstein and Norfolk realized they were witnessing a new hybrid form of warfare, human audacity meshing seamlessly with improvised tech. "This is 21st century insurgency in action," commented former RAF analyst Marcus Elwood to DW. "You're seeing garage-built innovation defeating billion-dollar weapons." As dawn neared, the Havoc ran low on ammunition. Its pilot, unable to identify targets amid thick smoke and static interference, was forced to retreat toward the base. But for the partisans, survival was not victory. It was transition. Their escape route led toward a secondary objective, a nearby logistics bridge that still funneled fuel and ammunition to the southern front. They had survived Russia's wrath. The next strike would determine whether that survival meant something more. Would the coming hours transform one act of sabotage into the collapse of an entire front line? How many drones does it take to bring down a bridge, and with it, an entire front line's supply chain? At 3:12 a.m., an eerie mechanical hum rose above the valley outside Novocherkassk. 20 FPV drones, each carrying a 2-pound C4 charge, launched from a hidden meadow. They flew low, barely 3 meters above ground, racing through fog at 60 miles per hour. What looked like a swarm of fireflies on radar was in fact the most devastating home-built weapon Ukraine had ever deployed on Russian soil. These drones weren't autonomous. Each was flown manually through a fiber optic tether by an operator wearing a VR headset. No radio signals, no GPS, just raw instinct. The Partisans laser designed to blind drone optics was useless. The pilots flew blind, relying on vibration and timing. Their target, the 600-foot concrete bridge linking Novocherkassk's rail depot to the Zaporizhzhia supply corridor. Destroying it would sever 60% of ammunition and fuel flows to Russia's southern front. Reuters later confirmed that this single bridge had handled more than 20 trains daily before the strike. At 3:14 a.m., the first drone slammed into the bridge's midsection, punching a hole in the outer shell of concrete. Then came 19 more detonating in rapid sequence. Each explosion chipped deeper, stripping the weathered surface until the steel skeleton beneath lay exposed. The pressure waves, over 30,000 pounds per square inch, created spiderweb cracks that raced through the support pillars. It was an engineering-level demolition disguised as guerrilla warfare, noted BBC defense correspondent Paul Adams, citing NATO engineers who reviewed seismic data. Within seconds, the bridge began to groan under its own weight. A low rumble built to a thunderous roar as two central pillars collapsed in sequence. Metal shrieked, concrete buckled. Then, with a single deafening crack, the structure folded into the river below. Satellite images from Al Jazeera labs later showed the span submerged beneath churning water rails, twisted like ribbons of molten steel. Economically, the impact was seismic. Analysts from DW estimated the loss at over $20 million in direct reconstruction costs, not counting the logistical collapse it caused. 3 supply trains behind the destroyed section screeched to a halt. For the next 72 hours, the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson fronts starved of ammunition. Artillery positions went silent. The disruption was the most significant logistical failure since the Kerch Bridge attack, wrote Defense News in its October 2025 briefing. NATO analysts believe this operation was part of a larger strategy aimed at testing Russia's ability to adapt under pressure. It's not about one bridge, it's about the psychological message, said retired U.S. Army Colonel Patrick Reed to The Guardian. Ukraine is proving that no depth inside Russia is truly safe anymore. For Moscow, the blow was more than structural, it was symbolic. The bridge had been upgraded in 2022 under a Kremlin infrastructure program touted as unbreakable. Now, live-streamed images from local residents contradicted that boast. Flames reflected off the water as the Atesh team withdrew under cover of smoke, their exfiltration route secured by the chaos they themselves had created. By dawn, Russian emergency crews were scattered, some rushing toward the collapsed bridge, others toward the still-burning ammunition depot. The region was in full crisis mode, its communications grid jammed by its own defensive systems. But in the confusion, one crucial question loomed. Had Ukraine merely crippled a bridge or triggered a domino effect that could freeze Russia's southern war machine altogether? What happens when one broken bridge unravels an entire war front? By sunrise on October 12, 2025, Russia's southern command was paralyzed. The destruction of the Novocherkassk rail line had created more than a logistical gap. It triggered a cascading collapse that rippled across 3 regions. Supply convoys stalled, communication lines overloaded, and commanders shouted over one another on jammed frequencies. According to Reuters satellite tracking, at least 4 supply trains were immobilized behind the destroyed bridge, holding over 8,000 artillery shells and hundreds of barrels of aviation fuel. By midday, frontline units in Zaporizhzhia began reporting critical shortages. The once relentless Russian artillery fire fell silent. DW confirmed that shelling density dropped by 62% within 48 hours, a figure so drastic that Ukrainian ground forces advanced 5.6 kilometers along a previously static line near Orikhiv. This was not a battle won by firepower, wrote Defense News analyst Michael Weiss. It was won by physics and timing. Behind the lines, chaos deepened. Moscow's internal intelligence service, the FSB, launched a sweeping mole hunt, ironically just as Atesh had planned. Those rumors of betrayal, seeded weeks before, now consumed valuable manpower. Senior officers accused one another of sabotage. The Guardian reported intercepted communications from Rostov Command, showing infighting so severe that one logistics colonel was detained by his own troops. For 72 hours, Russia's Southern Command operated in what NATO later described as self-inflicted operational paralysis. Economically, the ripple was brutal. Oil shipments rerouted from the Caspian corridor slowed deliveries to the Black Sea ports, driving up domestic fuel prices by nearly 4% within 2 days, according to Al Jazeera Business. Analysts compared the disruption to a micro-energy shock, highlighting how a localized sabotage could strain Russia's already fragile wartime economy. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone footage showed abandoned convoys stretching for kilometers, their engines cold and tires buried in dust. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration remained publicly cautious but privately supportive of Ukraine's growing asymmetric success. A senior U.S. defense official told NYT that American intelligence quietly celebrated the strike's precision, viewing it as proof that Western-trained Ukrainian engineers were outsmarting rather than outspending their opponent. NATO logistics analysts met in Brussels 2 days later to discuss expanding Ukraine's use of psychological and engineering warfare, an emerging field that European defense colleges now call infrastructure denial strategy. Even within Russia, dissent spread. A BBC Russian investigation found locals near Novocherkassk posting encrypted social media messages celebrating the sabotage as a strike against corruption, evidence that Moscow's internal narrative control was slipping. As one Western diplomat in Warsaw put it, the shockwave was not just military, it was moral. By October 14th, the once stable southern corridor had turned into a graveyard of stalled trains, collapsed trust, and disoriented command. But as Ukrainian forces exploited the silence of the Russian guns, a new question began circulating in NATO situation rooms. Had Ukraine reached the pinnacle of asymmetric success, or merely opened a new phase of escalation? For Kyiv, that question wasn't theoretical. The next move would determine whether Russia's paralyzed front could ever recover, or whether Ukraine was about to push its advantage beyond repair. If the bridge was only the first domino, what chain reaction would the next strike set in motion? What if this single sabotage marked not just a victory, but the birth of a new kind of warfare? In the days following the Novocherkassk strike, Western analysts from Defense News, BBC, and Al Jazeera converged on one conclusion: Ukraine had transformed low-cost ingenuity into strategic dominance. The Atesh operation was no isolated act of heroism. It was a prototype for how small forces could dismantle massive systems. By weaponizing deception, psychology, and timing, Ukraine had rewritten the rulebook of modern logistics warfare. Satellite data released by Reuters showed that rail traffic in southern Russia fell by more than 70% in the 10 days following the bridge collapse. Ammunition reserves dwindled. Factories in Rostov and Volgograd slowed output as raw materials stopped arriving. You can rebuild a bridge in 6 months, noted U.S. Air Force analyst Sarah Haynes to DW. But you can't rebuild command confidence in 6 days. This collapse in operational trust, she added, was far more dangerous than any physical loss. Inside NATO, the incident sparked a quiet revolution in defense thinking. The alliance's logistics committee meeting in Brussels under Article 4 consultations studied Ukraine's use of swarm drones and field improvisation as a model for post-industrial disruption tactics. Even as President Donald Trump emphasized in Washington that the U.S. seeks peace through strength, Pentagon insiders acknowledged that Ukraine's innovation, amplified by Western training and data sharing, was exposing vulnerabilities far beyond Russia. We're learning from them now, one defense contractor told The Guardian. They're turning $500 drones into tools that neutralize $5 million systems. Meanwhile, Russia scrambled to recover. Emergency crews worked around the clock to rebuild the bridge using prefabricated sections shipped from Taganrog. But the repairs were symbolic. Supply delays persisted. Every new convoy faced ambush risk, and morale plummeted. According to Al Jazeera, Russian state media downplayed the incident, calling it a localized technical issue. But leaked FSB documents told another story. Internal directives ordered the tightening of information flow to prevent panic among troops. The wider geopolitical impact was unmistakable. European analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly concluded that Ukraine's strike represented a proof of concept for NATO's hybrid doctrine, showing how targeted infrastructure denial could replace conventional frontline assaults. In Warsaw and Tallinn, policymakers urged investment in counter-sabotage units, and autonomous defense grids, fearing similar tactics, could one day turn westward. For Russia, the damage extended beyond infrastructure. It struck at identity. A military long defined by brute force now found itself bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts. As one retired Russian colonel admitted anonymously to BBC Russia, "They're not fighting our army anymore, they're fighting our assumptions." By the end of October, the Zaporizhzhia front had stabilized, but the psychological aftershocks endured. Every radar blip, every vibration on a railway line now carried the ghost of Novocherkassk. Ukraine's message to the world was clear. The battlefield of the 21st century is not just fought with missiles, it's coded, planned, and executed with intelligence sharper than steel. So, as both sides recalibrate, the question remains: if a handful of partisans can cripple a billion-dollar supply chain in one night, what happens when that ingenuity scales up across the continent?